40% of the world's seaborne oil passes through a body of water that is, at its narrowest point, just 33 kilometers wide. 33 kilometers. That's narrower than the English Channel. Narrower than the distance between some cities and their suburbs. And for decades, every major economy on Earth, the United States, China, Japan, South Korea, India, has quietly accepted that this single corridor could, under the right circumstances, be closed, not just disrupted. Closed. The Strait of Hormuz sits between Iran and Oman. It is not controlled by any neutral international body. It is not protected by any treaty that all parties have agreed to honor. It is simply there, a geographic accident that became the single most critical choke point in the global energy system. Military planners have war-gamed its closure for 50 years. Economists have modeled the consequences. Shipping insurers have built entire risk categories around it. And yet the world kept flowing its oil through it because there was no real alternative. Except that's not entirely true. Because at some point in the last 3 decades, a small group of strategists, engineers, and government planners began working on something that almost nobody outside the region knows about. A project designed to make the Strait of Hormuz irrelevant, not through diplomacy, not through military force, through infrastructure. What they designed, and what they partially built, would have rerouted the flow of global energy, redrawn regional power, and changed the economics of oil forever. This is the story of that project. For most people, the Strait of Hormuz is just a name on a map, a thin blue line between two landmasses. But for the people who run the global economy, the energy ministers, the naval commanders, the logistics chiefs at the world's largest shipping firms, it is something else entirely. It is the valve. Every single day, somewhere between 17 and 21 million barrels of crude oil move through that strait, loaded onto tankers in Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the UAE, Qatar, headed for refineries in China, Japan, South Korea, Europe, and the United States. That is roughly 1/5 of all the oil consumed on Earth, every single day. And the strait is not just narrow. It is shallow in places, tightly channeled, and bordered on one side by a country that has, on multiple occasions, threatened to shut it down entirely. Iran has never been subtle about this. In 1987, Iranian gunboats attacked tankers moving through the strait. The U.S. Navy had to physically escort commercial vessels through the water. In 2011, when Western sanctions began tightening around Tehran's nuclear program, Iranian military commanders publicly announced they could close the strait in less than 24 hours. They weren't bluffing about the capability. The Iranian coastline along the strait is lined with anti-ship missile batteries, fast attack boat bases, and submarine pens. The geography itself works in their favor. The tanker lanes run close to the Iranian side. A single coordinated strike could halt global oil flow for days, possibly weeks, and the markets knew it. Every time tensions spiked in the Gulf, oil prices moved, sometimes violently. The world's largest economies had built their entire energy infrastructure around a corridor one hostile nation could threaten at will. The question was never whether someone would try to build a way around it. The question was who got there first, and what they were willing to sacrifice to do it. The answer, when it came, didn't come from Washington. It didn't come from Beijing, or Brussels, or London. It came from a desert, specifically from a planning office inside the Abu Dhabi National Energy Company, sometime in the mid-2000s, during one of the most volatile periods in Gulf geopolitical history. The Iraq War had destabilized the region. Iranian influence was expanding, and the UAE, one of the world's top 5 oil exporters, was moving nearly all of its crude through the Strait of Hormuz, every barrel, every day, through that same narrow corridor. For UAE planners, this wasn't just a strategic vulnerability. It was an existential one. So they began designing something that had never been seriously attempted in the modern era. A crude oil pipeline long enough, large enough, and strategically positioned enough to completely bypass the strait. Not a supplementary route, a replacement route. The project was called the Abu Dhabi Crude Oil Pipeline. Internally, in early planning documents, some engineers simply referred to it as the bypass. The concept was straightforward in theory, brutal in execution. A pipeline would run from the Habshan oil fields in the interior of Abu Dhabi, deep in the desert, far from any coastline, westward across the peninsula, terminating at a brand new export terminal on the Gulf of Oman. On the other side of the strait, that last detail was the entire point. The Gulf of Oman connects directly to the Arabian Sea, to the Indian Ocean, to the world, without passing through a single kilometer of Iranian-controlled waters. If it worked, the UAE could export oil even if the strait was completely sealed. But here's what the early planning documents didn't fully account for. The terrain between Habshan and the coast wasn't just difficult. In places, it was considered nearly impassable. The Hajar Mountains don't look like much on a standard map. A thin brown ridge running along the eastern edge of the Arabian Peninsula. Easy to overlook, easy to underestimate. But on the ground, they are a different problem entirely. Jagged, fractured, rising sharply from the desert floor to elevations above 3,000 meters in places. The rock is ancient and dense, some of the hardest geological formations in the entire Middle East. And the pipeline had to cross them, not around them, not under a convenient valley, directly through terrain that had defeated infrastructure planners for generations. The engineering consortium brought in to assess the route spent months on geological surveys. Their internal reports described sections of the planned corridor as technically challenging beyond standard pipeline construction parameters. That was the professional language. What they meant was, this had never been done here before. The pipeline itself was designed to carry 1.5 million barrels of crude oil per day. For context, that is more than the entire daily oil output of most OPEC member nations. The pipe diameter, 48 inches. The total length, 370 kilometers. And it had to maintain pressure, structural integrity, and leak-proof operation across desert heat that regularly exceeds 50 degrees Celsius through mountain terrain prone to seismic activity, across ground that in some sections had never been mapped at the level of detail the project required. The construction workforce at peak operation numbered in the thousands. Most of them had no idea what they were actually building. They were told it was a standard infrastructure project, an internal energy corridor. The strategic purpose, the bypass function, was kept deliberately quiet because someone else had noticed the construction, and they were not pleased. Iranian intelligence had been watching the construction since the early phases. Satellite imagery, port monitoring, trade registry filings for the specialized pipeline equipment being shipped into UAE ports. They pieced it together the same way any competent state intelligence apparatus would. And when Tehran finally understood what was being built, the response was immediate, not military, not yet, diplomatic. Iranian officials began quietly pressuring other Gulf states to distance themselves from the project. The message, delivered through back channels, was direct. Any infrastructure designed to circumvent Iranian strategic leverage in the strait would be treated as a hostile act. Some regional governments listened, but the UAE didn't stop. What happened next, though, wasn't Iranian interference. It was something the engineers hadn't fully modeled. The terminal at Fujairah, the endpoint of the entire pipeline, the port where tankers would load bypassed oil for global markets, began attracting attention it wasn't designed to handle. Fujairah sits on the Gulf of Oman. It had historically been a minor bunkering port, a refueling stop. But as word spread through the shipping industry that a major crude export terminal was coming online there, the port began transforming faster than its infrastructure could absorb. New storage tanks, new berths, new shipping traffic. And with that traffic came something nobody in the original planning documents had adequately addressed: the environmental load on the Gulf of Oman coastline. Increased tanker movements through waters that contain some of the most sensitive coral reef systems in the Arabian Sea. Ballast water discharge, hydrocarbon runoff from expanded storage facilities. Marine biologists working in the region began documenting changes in reef health within 2 years of the terminal becoming operational. But the environmental concerns, significant as they were, turned out to be the secondary problem. The primary problem was what the pipeline's existence did to the regional power calculation. It didn't reduce tension in the strait. It quietly, almost invisibly, made it worse. The Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline became fully operational in 2012, quietly, without ceremony, without a single international press conference. The UAE government released a brief official statement. A few trade publications ran short items, and then the world moved on. But what the pipeline actually represented didn't move on. Because here is what it achieved and what it didn't. At full capacity, the pipeline can move 1.5 million barrels per day to Fujairah. That covers roughly 60% of the UAE total crude export volume, which means, for the first time in history, a major Gulf oil producer had genuine strategic options if the strait closed. Not complete independence, but enough. enough to survive a closure, enough to keep contracts, enough to tell the world we are not entirely hostage to that corridor anymore. And that shift, subtle as it appeared on paper, changed the calculation for every other Gulf state watching. Saudi Arabia accelerated studies on its own bypass infrastructure. Iraq began reviewing alternative southern export routes. Kuwait quietly commissioned new feasibility assessments. The UAE hadn't just built a pipeline. It had demonstrated that the geography could be beaten, but here is the part that rarely gets discussed. Iran understood this, and some analysts who track Gulf military posture believe that the pipeline's existence, the proof that bypass infrastructure was viable, contributed to a hardening of Iranian strategic thinking around the strait in the years that followed. Because if the strait's leverage was slowly being engineered away, the window to use that leverage was closing. That logic has not disappeared. The pipeline is still operating today. The terminal at Fujairah is still expanding. And the strait is still, on most mornings, full of tankers. But the question that the engineers in that Abu Dhabi planning office first asked 2 decades ago, what happens if it closes, now has a partial answer. The rest of that answer is still being written. If stories like this one matter to you, the ones that happen quietly, in deserts, in planning offices, in waters most people will never see, consider subscribing. There are more of them than most people realize.